Hey everybody, this is Desperate on Gaming with episode 6, match number 1 with Modern Burn. This particular list we're working on a list submitted by a viewer, Nathan Lord, very similar to what we were playing last go round with Boros splashing Cindervines. Only he had some adjustments to the main deck. He took out the 4 copies of Eidolon, put them on the sideboard, and instead chose to run 3 Shard Volley and a 2nd copy of Grim Lavamancer. So we're going to be running some matches using this list. He didn't really tell me what cards he cut or trimmed in the sideboard over the list we were running, so I just went ahead and cut a couple of Ensnaring Bridges and 2 of the copies of Cindervines to fit in the copies of Eidolon of the Great Revel. So also he's running Light Up the Stage over Lightning Helix, so a little bit more akin to the Rakdos builds, only instead of running Bump in the Night, we're running Boros Charm. So that's pretty much the change. We have 1 Stomping Ground for a couple copies of sideboard Cindervines. Beyond that, we are a straight Boros list, running 4 Skewer the Critcs and 4 Lay at the Stage, using Shard Volley as an additional 1-mana spell. Many you may know from the channel, I'm not a huge fan of Shard Volley, but I think in some numbers in these Lord to the Ground burn lists it can be perfectly fine. So that being said, let's go ahead and hop into some matches. Sideboard, a couple Path to Exile here for the creature decks, along with Searing Blood. Rest in Peace for the graveyard deck, Skullcrack for any type of life gain shenanigans. Eidolon and Cindervines can come in against anything featuring a lot of spells. Eidolon particularly against decks like Storm, Control, etc. Cindervines, many of the same situations, although you'll also bring in Cindervines in situations where you either expect your opponent having something like Leyline of Sanctity to board in, or Chalice of the Void, or just coming against straight up matchups like, you know, Affinity, Bogles, etc., where you need a Destructive Revelry-esque effect. And as a friendly reminder, if you're new to the channel and like what you're seeing, please consider subscribing, giving us a thumbs up, and leaving a constructive comment down below. I'll be sure to respond as soon as possible. And we're going to do 2-man queues because this is a viewer-submitted list, and I tend to, situations like this, I normally do like a actual stream of somebody's list, but streaming will be coming back next week once school is finished up for the semester, which I basically only have physical classes in the first half of the semester, so live streams will be coming back for things like this. But for right now, I figured if it worked into our normal burn schedule, so this hand's pretty reasonable. We do want to need to draw a second land to kind of deploy things pretty quickly, so beyond that, you know, obviously having the 3/1 drop hand and a bolt is usually pretty nice. So opponent roll getting a 5 usually indicates something like Dredge or... okay. Hopefully we're not getting Chalice next turn. Really want our opponent to Pathos here. However, it looks like we're going to be up against some type of Death and Taxes strategy, which is unfortunate given our lack of lands here. Or it might be humans, I suppose. Oh, it's Chalice. That's not good. Means basically our entire hand's locked out. We're obligated to Boros Charm here. Otherwise our hand's just going to get too clogged up. So even though our opponent's playing a very terrible deck, we are in danger of losing game 1 here. these style of decks don't tend to do particularly well in Modern, but as Chalice of the Void gets better, then maybe what our opponent's doing gets better. Alright. Play tapped, pass the turn. We have nothing else we can do this turn. If we would have on play, we probably would have quite easily obliterated them. So they are mono white Eldrazi and taxes. Looks like maybe a Eldrazi displacer. So we still need to basically draw two of our random 2-drop spells and draw like Searing Blaze or it definitely cuts our outs, but we do still have some amount of outs here. Those are 2 cards we cannot cast, however. So that means we're likely dead here. Just trying to buy some turns here. And game. Alright, it's definitely have to bring in Center Vines for Chalice. Bring in Path, and Searing Blood. Got 1 copy of Shard Volley. And some amount of Boros Charms here. Also cut copy of Lava Spike, so we're trying to get as much creature removal in our deck. I suppose Eidolon could be reasonable. Particularly on the play here, but I don't know what all I'd take out in all honesty. I think if we were on the play, we probably would have won that game, but Chalice of the Void is such an obnoxious card. Particularly for our deck. Yep, so these are the kind of hands that Shard Volley is pretty terrible in. opponent's playing mono white Eldrazi and Taxes. It's not a deck you see a lot of. It's got access to Chalice, it's got access to the Eldrazi, it's got access to some, you know, getting turn 1 Eldrazi Displacer would be annoying. It could very easily have like something like that's exactly what it looks like what's going to happen. Nope. Am I going to get turn 1 Thought-Knot Seared? Sure. Opponents had to expend probably, I don't know, 3 resources to get a Thought-Knot Seer into play on turn 1, which, while it's a powerful effect, they are kind of spewing resources over there. See what they play this turn. Getting Chaliced on top of all this. Guess we have to 2-for-1 ourselves, get this off the board. I guess it's basically a 2-for-2 trade here. Pass turn. Sure, you're really not getting anything useful out of my hand. Playing known information, I'm aware of that, or unknown information, but it really doesn't do anything because we really need to start trying to thin our deck a little bit. Yep. Trying to play on here, soldiers, but situations like this, it's just like, the game is over. We can't cast any more 1-drops, we're flooding out, and our opponents, well, I guess our opponent's Thought-Knot Seer wouldn't have done a whole lot in the face of what was going on. This feels like a Chalice for 2. Oh. Because of their Thalia, they had to play, Play an extra thing there. I mean, in the current format, Chalice on 1 and Chalice on 2 is perfectly reasonable in the against a lot of decks, especially when you have as many ways to cheat mana with Eldrazi Temples, the Gemstone Mines, the Simian Spirit Guides. I'd like to say good game opponent, but in a lot of ways your deck's pretty terrible, and just got lucky that we happen to be very vulnerable to Chalice of the Void, which obviously, you know, it's a good meta call. Burn's vulnerable to it now. Is it Phoenix is vulnerable to it? Death Shadow is kind of vulnerable to it. So, as far as the top tier decks, Chalice, especially for 1 on turn 1 or 2, is pretty good in the format right now, and that's a lot of what Modern is anymore. It's really matchups and cards, like specific cards beat specific decks. Like Burn struggles against Chalice and Leyline. Is it Phoenix struggles against Chalice and some type of graveyard hate. You know, Death Shadow struggles against Chalice, Dredge struggles against Rest in Peace and Surgical Extraction, etc. So, a lot of Modern is getting the correct hate cards for the matchup. You know, in a format with 30 or 40 playable decks, that can be tricky. Is it Phoenix? And to a lesser extent, when it was popular, KCI, you know, kind of narrow down the hate cards you got to run. But that does make the gaps, quote unquote, where those decks are. Like, say, you know, when Burn's good and Is It Phoenix is good, it means there's more Chalice of the Void decks, but then that means decks like Control or, you know, Black-Green Rock are just like sitting there going, your cards do nothing against me, you've just weakened yourself. You know, there's a price to pay for the style of cards you choose to run on your deck. Like, I'm vulnerable because I'm running a bunch of 1-drops to Chalice of the Void. My opponent, by playing kind of this terrible mid-range deck, is vulnerable to something like Ad Nauseam, or Control that doesn't care about Chalice on 1, or etc. So, you know, there's always a vulnerability for the style of deck you choose to play, and I think in Modern that's just kind of accented. Like, if we'd run up against Tron, our Tron opponent, you know, can dominate the mid-range decks, the control decks, but they're vulnerable to decks like Burn, they're vulnerable to decks like Storm, etc. So, every deck you run in Modern has a certain subset of cards it's weak against, and you have to understand that, so maybe we should be playing Force Intervines. I apologize to Nathan Lord that their first go round with the deck didn't go very well, but you know, this was just a matchup where our opponent had Chalice on 1, and that's like half of our deck. So we still almost won game 1. Game 2 was a little bit less enthusiastic when your opponent goes, you know, turn 1, and I'm not mistaken, that turn 1 Thought Not Seer. Kind of hard to beat turn 1 Thought Not Seer into turn 2 Chalice of the Void. So, anyways, it's kind of a bit of a ramble about, you know, even though a deck is not quote-unquote good, you still can lose to it just because of matchup problems and your opponent's draws being exceptionally good, and we kind of ran into that combination of stuff. So, this has been us for Listed on Gaming with episode 6, match number 1 with Boros Burn here, a viewer's Nathan Lord's list we're working on. So, let's get into some other matches for it, shall we?